The clock struck midnight, and in that single chime, the house held its breath, because somewhere within its ancient walls, a secret was stirring. A child had vanished, yet no doors had been opened, no footsteps had been heard. The ransom note lay untouched on the velvet pillow, pinned there by an unseen hand, and in the suffocating silence, one truth became undeniable. This was not just a kidnapping. This was a game, and the real mystery was not who had taken the boy, but why they wanted everyone to believe he was gone. Dear audiobook lovers, today we have an electrifying mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe to the Curious Case channel to unlock the most thrilling detective stories and never miss a new mystery. The Shadow over Blackwood Manor is a chilling new detective tale that delves into the sinister secrets of an aristocratic family. Set in the haunting backdrop of post-war England, this gripping case unravels the fears of the elite, blackmail, betrayal, and a crime so perfectly orchestrated that even the sharpest minds struggle to unravel it. When the heir to the Blackwood estate vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only a cryptic note and a locked room, the renowned detective Alistair Graves is called upon. His razor-sharp intellect and uncanny ability to see through deception make him the only hope for solving a case that seems impossible. With time slipping away and shadows growing longer, the mystery deepens, secrets buried for decades resurface, and every clue leads to a new, unsettling revelation. The closer Graves gets to the truth, the deadlier the game becomes. Prepare yourself for a labyrinth of twists, hidden motives, and an ending that will leave you breathless. The Shadow over Blackwood Manor, a tale of deception, darkness, and deadly secrets. Detective Alistair Graves observed the man before him, a broad-shouldered, imposing figure with a weathered face that had likely seen many seasons of prosperity and privilege. Mr. Harrowby Blackwood, the patriarch of Blackwood Manor, had the look of a man unaccustomed to fear, yet there was something uneasy in his stance. His voice, deep and authoritative, carried an unmistakable tremor as he spoke. "I assume you've read the papers, Mr. Graves," he asked, pacing the length of the dimly lit study. The case had indeed made headlines. The baffling disappearance of young Sebastian Blackwood, the sole heir to the Blackwood estate, a boy of only 4 years. "The details, sir. I need them all," Graves replied, his piercing gaze never wavering. Blackwood exhaled sharply. "It began 2 weeks ago with an anonymous letter, vile absurd nonsense. The writer demanded £50,000, or they'd take my son. I dismissed it outright, thought it was the work of some lunatic. Then another letter came. If you do not comply, Sebastian will vanish on the 3rd of the month. That was 2 days before the 3rd. My wife Eleanor was frantic, but I refused to be intimidated. This is England, not some lawless land where children are plucked from their beds for ransom." He slammed his fist onto the desk, but the gesture reeked of helplessness rather than authority. Graves leaned forward slightly, his mind already weaving the possibilities. A wealthy, powerful family, a chillingly precise threat, and a missing child. This was no ordinary crime. This was a game, a cruel one, where every move had been calculated in advance, and the game had only just begun. "It's certainly not a common occurrence," murmured Detective Alistair Graves, his sharp gaze fixed on the man before him. "Continue, Mr. Blackwood." Harrowby Blackwood exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Eleanor was relentless. She wouldn't rest until I took action. Feeling utterly ridiculous, I brought the matter to the authorities. Scotland Yard, like myself, dismissed the letters as the work of a delusional crank. That changed with the 3rd letter. You have ignored our warnings. Your son will be taken from you at precisely noon on the 3rd. If you wish to see him again, it will cost you £100,000. He paused, his voice tightening with barely contained rage. "That sent me straight back to Scotland Yard. This time they took it seriously. Their conclusion? A madman. But a madman who, they feared, might attempt something drastic. They assured me they'd take every precaution. Detective Inspector Aldridge and his men would arrive at Blackwood Manor that very evening." Blackwood leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk as if trying to steady himself. "For a moment I allowed myself to breathe. We were secure. No one was permitted entry. No one could leave. The house was locked down like a fortress. That night passed without incident. But the following morning, Eleanor took ill violently so. We sent for Dr. Whitmore. He examined her, his brow creased with something I didn't like. He hesitated, unwilling to say the word, but I could see it in his eyes. Poison. Graves stiffened. Poison. Blackwood nodded grimly. He assured me there was no immediate danger, but she'd be confined to bed for at least 2 days. I returned to my study, my mind racing, and that's when I found it, a folded note pinned to my pillow. Impossible. The house was under lockdown, no one had entered, no one had left, and yet someone had been inside my very room, leaving behind their message. A cold silence settled between them, the weight of the revelation suffocating the space. Graves reached for the note, his gloved fingers unfolding it carefully. The words, scrawled in elegant yet menacing script, sent a chill down his spine. You were warned, now it begins. The note was written in the same precise, chilling hand as the others, just 3 words. At 12 o'clock. Blackwood's hands clenched into fists as he spoke. That was the moment I lost control. I knew then someone inside this house was part of this. Someone had placed that note on my pillow, under our very noses. It had to be one of the staff. I had them all gathered in the great hall, questioned them one by one, and made it very clear that I would not tolerate deception. But they held firm too firm. His voice was taut with frustration. Then Miss Harrow, my wife's companion, came forward. She had seen something. Early that morning, before the house had properly stirred, she had noticed young Sebastian's governess slip down the back path, moving hurriedly, as if to avoid being seen. His jaw tightened. I confronted her. She denied everything at first, then she broke, admitted she had left the boy in the care of the under-nurse while she ran out to meet someone, a man, a secret rendezvous, she claimed, a lover. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Damn foolishness. But had she pinned the note to my pillow? She swore she had not. I didn't know what to believe. I couldn't take the risk of keeping her in the house. I was certain now, one of the staff was involved, and if one was guilty, who was to say the others weren't? I had no choice. I dismissed them all, every single one, gave them an hour to pack their things and leave. Blackwood's face burned red at the memory of his fury. He had trusted these people, and yet, his son had been taken from under his roof. Graves remained still, his keen eyes watching. Then in a calm but deliberate voice, he said, "Was that not a bit rash, Mr. Blackwood? After all, you may have just played directly into your enemy's hands." Silence filled the room. A single candle flickered, casting long distorted shadows against the walls, and in that moment, for the first time, Blackwood looked truly afraid. Blackwood's expression hardened. "I don't see how that was a mistake. I wanted them all gone out of my house. I sent a wire to London for a new staff to be brought in by evening. Until then, only those I knew I could trust would remain. My wife's secretary, Miss Harrow, and Treadwell, my butler, who has served this family since I was a boy." Detective Graves steepled his fingers. "Miss Harrow, how long has she been with you?" "A year," Eleanor Blackwood answered. Though still pale from her illness, her voice was firm. "She has been an invaluable companion to me, an efficient housekeeper, and someone I trust implicitly." Graves gave a slow nod. "And the governess? She came to us 6 months ago with impeccable references, but..." Eleanor hesitated. "I never quite warmed to her. Sebastian adored her, but there was something distant about her. I cannot explain it." Graves tilted his head slightly. "But she was already gone when the incident took place." Blackwood exhaled. "Yes, I saw to that personally. She was dismissed along with the rest." He leaned forward again. "Now shall I continue?" Graves gestured for him to proceed. Detective Aldridge arrived at exactly 10:30. By then every servant had been removed from the estate. He examined the house, my security measures, and assured me we were prepared. His men were positioned strategically, guarding every approach to the manor. "If this isn't a hoax," he told me, "we will catch the bastard tonight." Blackwood's fingers drummed against the mahogany desk. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. I had this feeling, an unease I couldn't shake, as if something was slipping through our fingers. "We thought we were the hunters." His voice dropped to a near whisper, "but we were the prey." The heavy grandfather clock loomed over them, its brass pendulum swaying in rhythmic anticipation. Blackwood tightened his grip on Sebastian's small hand, his own palm clammy. Detective Aldridge stood beside them, his sharp eyes fixed on the ornate hands of the clock, as they inched towards 12. The tension in the council chamber was suffocating. A low whirring sound filled the room. The clock began to strike. The chimes echoed, each one reverberating through Blackwood's chest like the toll of impending doom. He braced himself, half expecting an intruder to crash through the ceiling or materialize from the shadows. Then chaos erupted. Shouts rang out from outside, the rapid thud of footsteps on gravel. Aldridge rushed to the window, flinging it open. Below, a constable came sprinting across the lawn. "We've got him, sir," the officer called, breathless. "Caught sneaking through the bushes, had a whole dope kit on him." Blackwood didn't wait. He bolted for the terrace, dragging Sebastian with him. There, under the glow of the estate's lanterns, two officers wrestled with a ragged, wild-eyed man, who thrashed like a trapped animal. One constable held up a bundle, a bottle of chloroform, and a thick pad of cotton wool. Blackwood's stomach turned. The other officer handed him a note. His fingers trembled as he tore it open. "You should have paid. The ransom is now 50,000. Despite your efforts, the boy is ours." Blackwood let out a sharp bark of laughter, relief washing over him, until the distant roar of an engine cut through the night. A shout, a blur of motion beyond the trees, and then the realization hit him like a blow to the chest. Sebastian was gone. The thunderous roar of an engine tore through the night, like a predator in pursuit. Blackwood spun around, just in time to see the sleek, low-bodied grey car hurtling down the gravel drive, a streak of silver against the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. Behind the wheel, a shadowy figure leaned forward with a manic determination, but it was the passenger seat that turned Blackwood's blood to ice. A head of golden curls. Sebastian. For a moment time itself seemed to stop. Blackwood could see the child's wide, uncomprehending eyes, his small frame pressed against the leather seat. Then, as though sensing his father's gaze, Sebastian turned his head. Their eyes met just for an instant, before the car shot forward, vanishing beyond the iron gates. Aldridge swore violently. The boy was here barely a minute ago. He turned, scanning the stunned faces around him. "When did you last see him, Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood's mind reeled. Just moments earlier, he had been clutching Sebastian's hand, feeling the tiny warmth of his son's palm against his own. Then what? The commotion outside, the shouting, the masked man restrained on the ground, the chloroform, his own moment of relief. That was when his heart pounded. He had let go. Suddenly a distant sound split the silence, the chime of the village church bell. 12 slow, resounding tolls. Aldridge's eyes flickered with realization. He yanked his pocket watch free and flipped it open. 12 on the dot, he muttered. Then, as if possessed by a shared thought, they turned as one and sprinted back inside the manor. The council chamber door slammed open, the grand oak-paneled walls swallowing them whole. All eyes darted to the massive grandfather clock that stood like a sentry in the corner. The pendulum swayed in an almost mocking rhythm. The time read 10 minutes past 12. "Tampered with," Aldridge growled, his fingers running over the ornate brass casing. "Someone set this ahead, to trick us, to make sure we were all out there at exactly the right moment." His voice hardened. "To leave the boy unprotected." A sinister stillness crept into the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Blackwood clenched his fists. Whoever had orchestrated this had done so with terrifying precision. Every second had been accounted for, every reaction predicted. The letter, the diversion, the chloroform, distractions, all of them. He had played right into their hands. A sharp gasp broke the silence. Mrs. Blackwood, her face pale, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "But my son," she choked out, her voice desperate. "He's out there with them. What if they—" Poirot, who had thus far been silent, finally stepped forward. A small, knowing smile played at the corner of his lips. With practiced calm, he smoothed out the creased edge of a table mat Blackwood had unknowingly pushed askew. "It is a charming puzzle," he murmured, almost to himself. "A most elaborate game, played with great precision." He straightened, his gaze sharp as steel. "But do not fear, madame. Your son is quite unharmed." Mrs. Blackwood flinched. "How can you possibly know that?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with something unreadable. "Because, madame," he said gently, "to them he is not a mere child. He is the goose that lays the golden eggs. and a broken goose lays no treasure, does it? Blackwood exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Was Poirot right? Were these criminals truly after nothing more than money, or was there something far darker at play? He turned to Aldridge. "We get him back," he said, his voice a quiet promise, "no matter what it takes." Blackwood exhaled, his fingers tightening around the edge of the desk, as he recalled the harrowing sequence of events that followed. "You likely read the rest in the papers," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. Inspector Aldridge acted at once, putting out an alert across the county. Every road leading out of Blackwood Manor was barricaded. Every officer within a 50-mile radius was given the description of the vehicle and its occupant. For a brief moment, it seemed as though luck was on our side. Poirot listened intently, adjusting the precise angle of a small paperweight on the desk, as if the tiniest disorder offended his sensibilities. Blackwood continued, his jaw clenched. Reports trickled in. A grey car, matching the description, had been sighted on the main road toward London. A man fitting the given appearance had been seen with a young child. A petrol station attendant noted that the boy had been crying, visibly distressed, frightened. A shopkeeper in Littlehampton recalled the child pulling away when the man reached for him. Mrs. Blackwood let out a soft gasp, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. "Sebastian, it seemed," Blackwood went on, "that we had them. The roads were being watched. Officers set up blockades, and it wasn't long before Aldridge received confirmation. A car had been stopped near Edenswell, a village 15 miles away. The driver, a man with a young boy in tow, had been detained for questioning." He let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "I almost collapsed from relief. The nightmare was over, or so I thought." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "It was not him," Blackwood inhaled sharply. "No, it wasn't." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing. "The man in question was no criminal. He was an innocent motorist, an enthusiastic driver who simply enjoyed long country rides. He had spotted a young child playing on the streets of Edenswell, and meaning no harm, had offered him a short ride." A suffocating silence filled the room. Mrs. Blackwood's voice broke as she whispered, "Then where was my son?" Blackwood turned to Poirot, his expression dark with a mixture of rage and helplessness. "That's what I intend to find out." Poirot tapped a delicate finger against his chin. His eyes held an unreadable glint, his mind already weaving together the invisible threads of logic. This was no random act. Non mon ami. This was an illusion, a trick designed to deceive. The kidnappers wanted you to believe the boy was heading for London, so you would chase a shadow while they slipped away in the opposite direction. Blackwood's breath hitched. "Then where the hell did they take him?" Poirot tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "That, monsieur, is the real question, and one we shall answer before it is too late." Blackwood's fists clenched on the desk, as he exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. "Thanks to the overconfidence and sheer incompetence of the authorities, all traces of my son have now vanished. Had they not wasted precious hours chasing the wrong vehicle, they might have already found him." His voice was tight with barely restrained fury. Poirot, ever composed, merely adjusted the angle of his cuff. "Calm yourself, monsieur. The police are dedicated men, and though their mistake was costly, it was also a natural one. The deception was well executed. A false trail, meticulously planned, clever, His dark eyes glinted with quiet calculation. As for the man captured on the estate grounds, his defense remains unchanged." Blackwood scoffed. "You mean his ridiculous pack of lies?" "Perhaps." Poirot raised a delicate brow. "But consider the details. He maintains that he was merely a courier, nothing more. He claims the note and parcel were given to him by an unknown man, a stranger who pressed a 10-shilling note into his palm, with the promise of another upon successful delivery. His instructions were precise: enter the estate grounds, approach the house through the eastern garden, and knock on the side door at exactly 10 minutes to 12. Mrs. Blackwood gasped, her voice edged with anger. "And you expect us to believe that? It's absurd." Poirot inclined his head. "En vérité, madame, it is a fragile story, flimsy as the thread of a spider's web, and yet, despite their best efforts, the authorities have not yet unraveled it." He turned to Blackwood, his gaze sharpening. "I also understand, monsieur, that during his interrogation, the man made a rather interesting accusation." A flicker of something, hesitation, perhaps shame, crossed Blackwood's face. His posture stiffened. "That's nonsense. You don't mean to suggest—" Poirot leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. "Oh, but I suggest nothing, monsieur. I merely ask, what exactly did he claim?" Blackwood's jaw tightened. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tensions. Then finally, he spoke. "He named someone in this house." Mrs. Blackwood stiffened, a cold shiver creeping up her spine. "Who?" she whispered. Blackwood's voice was barely above a breath. "Miss Ashford." A stillness fell over the room, heavy as the weight of a falling guillotine. Poirot exhaled softly, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "Now we begin to see the shape of things." Blackwood's expression darkened, his fingers tapping impatiently against the armrest of his chair. "The nerve of that man, to claim he recognized Treadwell as the one who gave him the parcel. Only the bloke has shaved off his moustache," he said. "Preposterous. Treadwell, who has been in my family's service since before I was born, who grew up on this estate." His outrage burned in his voice, but Poirot, ever composed, merely tilted his head slightly. "Yet, monsieur, you yourself believe that someone within this house played a part in your son's abduction." Blackwood hesitated, shifting in his seat. "Yes, but not Treadwell." Poirot's gaze flickered toward Mrs. Blackwood, his question coming swiftly. "And you, madame, what do you think?" Her response was instant, her voice firm. "It could not have been Treadwell. That man's story is absurd. If he was given a parcel at all, which I very much doubt, it was not from Treadwell. He claims it happened at 10 o'clock, yet at that very time, Treadwell was in the smoking room with my husband." Poirot inclined his head, his fingers tracing an invisible line upon the polished table. "An alibi then. But tell me, monsieur, when the car sped away, did you see the face of the driver? Could it in any way have resembled Treadwell's?" Blackwood frowned. It was too far away to make out his features clearly. "I only saw a silhouette, a shape, and—" his voice faltered for a second. "And I saw my son. That's all that mattered in that moment." Poirot allowed a brief silence to stretch before speaking again. "Does Treadwell have a brother?" "He had several," Blackwood admitted grudgingly, "but they are all dead. The last one was killed in the war." Poirot exhaled, his mind rapidly assembling the scattered pieces of the puzzle. "And the grounds of Waverly Court, monsieur, allow me to clarify. The car was heading towards the South Lodge, was it? Is there another entrance?" Blackwood nodded. "Yes, what we call the East Lodge. It's on the opposite side of the estate. If someone were watching from the east wing of the house, they could see it clearly." Poirot's lips pressed together in thought. "Curious," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. "Very curious indeed." Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Poirot, do you believe Johnnie is still alive?" Poirot turned to her, his gaze steady. "I do, madame." A flicker of hope flashed across her face before he continued. "But we are not merely hunting kidnappers, we are hunting a mastermind, and the game, I fear, is only just beginning. It seems odd to me that no one saw the car enter the grounds," Blackwood muttered, frustration tightening his voice. Poirot, ever thoughtful, tapped his fingers together. "Indeed, monsieur, a car does not simply materialize from thin air." Blackwood exhaled sharply. "There is a right-of-way that cuts through the estate, leading to an old chapel. Plenty of vehicles pass that way. It wouldn't have raised suspicion. The man must have stopped in a convenient spot, slipped out, and made his way to the house right as the commotion started. Everyone's attention was elsewhere." Poirot's sharp gaze flickered. "Unless," he mused, his voice low, "he was already inside the house." A heavy silence followed. The thought sent an uneasy ripple through the room. Blackwood frowned. "We didn't think to search the house beforehand. There didn't seem to be a reason after all. Why would he already be inside? But I suppose it's possible. That would mean someone let him in." Poirot nodded, his little smile returning. "We shall come to that in due course. One step at a time. Method. Always method." He leaned forward slightly. "Waverly Court is an old estate, is it not? Does it have any hidden chambers, secret passages?" Many such houses have priest holes, concealed spaces used in past centuries for hiding. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. Yes, there are rumors of such places, though I've never thought much of them. My grandfather used to speak of a hidden passage leading from the east wing to the library, but no one has ever found it. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. A hidden passage, intriguing. A house with secrets always has more than one mystery within its walls. Mrs. Blackwood, who had remained silent, spoke up suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. You mean he could have been inside all along, watching us, listening? Poirot nodded solemnly. It is a possibility we must not ignore. If our adversary had foreknowledge of the plan, he might have positioned himself in the most advantageous place. A chill seemed to settle over the room. Then that means, Blackwood hesitated, the realization dawning on him. Whoever did this knows this house. They knew where to hide. They knew our movements. Poirot gave a small nod. And that, monsieur, is what makes this case most fascinating. The silence was shattered by the distant chime of the grandfather clock, its heavy notes reverberating through the house. It sounded ominous, a reminder of the missing boy, the ticking clock, and the unseen danger lurking in the shadows of Waverly Court. Blackwood slammed a fist onto the table, his voice thick with urgency. By gad, there is a priest's hole, a concealed chamber behind one of the panels in the hall. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. Ah, now we are getting somewhere, monsieur. And tell me, how close is it to the council chamber? Blackwood hesitated for only a moment. Just outside the door. Voila! Poirot exclaimed softly, leaning back in satisfaction. His sharp gaze darted between the troubled faces in the room. Mrs. Blackwood clutched her hands tightly. But no one knows of its existence, except my husband and myself. Poirot's expression did not change. Ah, but secrets have a way of escaping, madame. What of Treadwell? Blackwood exhaled, rubbing his chin. Well, I suppose he might have heard of it. He's been with the family for decades. He knows every brick and stone of this house. Miss Collins, Poirot asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I have never mentioned it to her, Mrs. Blackwood said firmly, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Poirot tapped his fingers on the armrest of his chair, deep in thought. The revelation of the priest's hole changed everything. A hidden passage, right outside the council chamber. It was almost too perfect. If the intruder had been inside the house all along, waiting for the right moment, the abduction had not been a crime of opportunity. It had been meticulously planned. He straightened. Monsieur Blackwood, there is only one thing left to do. I must see Waverly Court for myself. If I arrive this afternoon, will that be suitable? Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward desperately. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, please, the sooner the better. My son is still out there, and time is slipping away. Poirot inclined his head, his expression turning solemn. Fear not, madame. I promise you, before this game is over, we shall uncover the truth. And rest assured, your son will be found. The heavy chime of the grandfather clock filled the room once more, each toll a chilling reminder of how little time remained. With trembling hands, Mrs. Blackwood thrust the crumpled letter into Poirot's grasp. The missive had arrived that morning, a cruel dagger of ink and threat. Its instructions were chillingly precise. How the ransom was to be paid, where and when. A single warning sealed the message. Any deception, any attempt at treachery, and your son will pay with his life. Poirot read it twice, his fingers smoothing over the edges of the paper. He could see the war waging within Mrs. Blackwood. A love of wealth clashed violently with a mother's desperate devotion, and at last, the latter was winning. Her breath was shallow, her eyes wild with the agony of uncertainty. As her husband moved toward the door, Poirot detained her with a slight gesture. Madame, before you go, tell me the truth. Do you share your husband's unwavering trust in Treadwell? She hesitated. I have nothing against him, Monsieur Poirot. I don't see how he could possibly be involved. But she swallowed, her voice dropping to a whisper. I have never liked him, never. Poirot's expression did not change, but he noted the flicker of doubt in her voice. I see. And one last question. Can you give me the address of the child's nurse? A flicker of confusion crossed her face. The nurse, what could she? She stopped herself, exhaling sharply. 149 Netherall Road, Hammersmith. But surely you don't suspect? Poirot raised a hand gently. Never do I suspect, madame. I merely observe. I employ the little grey cells, and sometimes, he added, his voice softer now, just sometimes, they whisper an idea to me. As the heavy doors of the study creaked closed behind her, Poirot stared down at the ransom note once more. A masterfully orchestrated crime indeed. But the human heart, that was always the weak link in any great scheme. Poirot turned to me, as the heavy door clicked shut behind Mrs. Blackwood. His eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. So madame has never liked the butler. An interesting little detail. No, Poirot's. He tapped his temple lightly. I remained silent. Over the years, Poirot had misled me too many times, dangling hints like breadcrumbs, only to reveal an entirely unexpected truth in the end. I had learned to tread carefully. There was always a hidden angle, always a trick waiting to be uncovered. After Poirot meticulously adjusted his cuffs, straightened his tie, and ensured his shoes were spotless, his idea of an elaborate outdoor toilet, we set off for Netherall Road. The narrow London street was lined with identical red-bricked houses, their facades worn with time. A cold wind swept through the air, rattling the iron railings as we approached 149. We were fortunate to find Miss Jessie Withers at home, a woman of about 35. She greeted us with a raised brow, her hands dusted with flour, as though she had been in the middle of baking. She had the air of someone both capable and practical, a woman who had faced life's hardships without losing her warmth. I could not, for the life of me, imagine her being tangled in such a sinister affair. Still, her bitterness toward her dismissal was unmistakable. I won't pretend I wasn't furious at first, she admitted, folding her arms, but I was in the wrong. I shouldn't have left the boy alone, no matter how briefly. She sighed, glancing toward the window. I was only stepping out for a moment to meet my fiancé. He's a painter and decorator, you see. He happened to be in the neighborhood that day, and I ran out to see him. The explanation was simple, too simple, natural enough to be believable, yet something about Poirot's expression told me he wasn't quite satisfied. His fingers drummed lightly against his walking cane, his sharp gaze sweeping over the modest room. I, on the other hand, couldn't understand his hesitation. The woman's story made sense. There was no indication of deceit, no nervous twitch to suggest a lie, and yet, Poirot only smiled to himself, his gaze drifting toward the mantelpiece where a small framed photograph sat. He murmured, almost too softly to hear, "Ah, mademoiselle, you have forgotten one small detail, have you not?" Poirot's questions, to me, felt entirely irrelevant. He probed into the most mundane details of Miss Withers' daily routine at Waverly Court, what time she took the boy out for walks, when the kitchen staff had their breaks, even what brand of tea was usually served. It was all so trivial that I struggled to stifle a yawn. When at last Poirot rose and took his leave, I followed him eagerly, relieved to escape the tedious interrogation. "Kidnapping is a simple affair, mon ami," Poirot mused as he hailed a taxi on the Hammersmith Road. "That child could have been taken any day, at any time, for the last 3 years." I frowned. "And how does that help us?" Poirot's mustache twitched with amusement. "Ah, Hastings, you have the eyes but not the vision. This fact advances us enormously. It tells us that the abduction was not a crime of opportunity. No, it was precise, deliberate, planned." As I opened my mouth to respond, he cut me off, reaching forward to adjust my tie pin with exaggerated care. "If you insist on wearing such adornments, my friend, at least ensure they are properly placed. Yours is a 1/16 of an inch too far to the right," I grumbled, but Poirot had already turned his attention to the passing streets. Soon we arrived at Waverly Court, a grand and ancient estate, its towering stone facade exuding an air of dignified history. The grounds stretched wide, neatly trimmed hedges and pathways winding through the vast green lawns. It was the sort of place that whispered secrets through its walls, where history clung to every brick and shadow. Mr. Waverly met us at the entrance, leading us through the estate with a brisk efficiency that barely concealed his underlying agitation. We toured the council chamber, where heavy oak beams lined the ceiling, the terrace overlooking the rolling hills, and at last, at Poirot's insistence, a rather peculiar place, the hidden passage. With a press of a concealed spring in the wall, a narrow panel slid open, revealing a darkened tunnel. The air inside was thick with age, the scent of damp stone and dust filling my nostrils as we stepped inside. "A priest's hole," Mr. Waverly explained, his voice barely above a whisper, "a relic from the days when this house harbored those fleeing persecution. It has remained untouched for centuries." Poirot stepped forward, his keen eyes scanning the passage, fingers trailing lightly along the stone walls. A smile played on his lips, as if he had just discovered a hidden thread in a tapestry. "Untouched, monsieur," he murmured. "Are you quite certain?" Mr. Waverly hesitated. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in Poirot's expression, a glint of triumph, a secret understanding that I had yet to grasp. The case was beginning to unfold, and I had the distinct feeling that, as always, Poirot was several steps ahead of us all. "You see," Waverly said with a tight smile, "there is nothing here." The priest's hole was nothing more than a small dimly lit chamber, its stone walls cold, its wooden floor undisturbed by any recent presence. There was no sign of forced entry, no objects left behind, not even a trace of dust displaced by hurried movement. If this had been used in the crime, it had been done with the utmost precision. I let out a sigh, convinced that Poirot's suspicions had finally led him nowhere, but as I turned I noticed him crouched in the corner, his gaze fixed upon the ground with intense concentration. He reached out, delicately tracing something in the dust with his fingertip. "What do you make of this, my friend?" he murmured. I stepped closer. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the smooth surface of the floor, then faint but distinct. I saw them 4 tiny imprints clustered together. "A dog!" I exclaimed. Poirot gave me a small approving nod. "Oui, mon ami, but what kind of dog?" I frowned. The marks were too small even for the average lapdog. A Pomeranian? Smaller. A Griffon? Smaller still. "A species," he added, his voice tinged with amusement, unknown to the Kennel Club. I looked at him sharply. There was something in his expression, an excitement barely contained, a glimmer of triumph that told me he had seen a connection I had missed entirely. "I was right," he whispered, more to himself than to us. "I knew I was right. Come, Hastings." As we stepped back into the corridor, the panel sliding seamlessly shut behind us, the sound of a door opening further down the passage caught our attention. A young woman stepped out, her presence precise, brisk, and entirely composed. Mr. Waverly gestured toward her. Miss Collins. Miss Collins was a woman of about 30, her fair hair pinned back neatly, her sharp eyes framed by pince-nez that seemed to amplify her natural air of efficiency. There was something about her stance, rigid, but not unkind, a woman who ran a household with calculated efficiency, tolerating no nonsense. Poirot, ever the observer, inclined his head politely. "Mademoiselle, might we have a word?" She led us into a small morning room, where Poirot wasted no time in questioning her about the household staff. His inquiries, though polite, were incisive, peeling back the layers of the estate's routine with practiced ease. And then, as though guiding her towards something inevitable, he asked, "Tell me, Miss Collins, what do you think of Treadwell?" A flicker of something, discomfort, hesitation, perhaps even dislike, crossed her face. She adjusted her pince-nez, her voice measured but firm. "I do not trust him, Monsieur Poirot," she admitted at last. "I never have." Poirot's expression did not change, but I knew at that moment that he had found exactly what he was looking for. "He gives himself airs," Miss Collins explained, her lips pursing slightly, as though she regretted saying so much. Poirot, ever meticulous, moved on to his next inquiry. The food. What had Mrs. Waverly eaten on the night of the 28th? Miss Collins, appearing mildly surprised by the question, stated that she herself had eaten identical dishes in her sitting room, and suffered no ill effects. Poirot's gaze flickered with interest, but he merely nodded. As she turned to leave, I nudged him lightly. "The dog," I whispered. Poirot's lips curled into a broad smile. "Ah, yes, the dog." He turned to Miss Collins. "Mademoiselle, forgive me, But is there a small dog kept anywhere in the house? A toy breed, perhaps? She frowned slightly, adjusting her pince-nez. No, Monsieur Poirot, we have 2 retrievers, but they remain in the kennels outside. No other dogs. None. Poirot inclined his head politely. Merci, mademoiselle. She left, and the moment the door clicked shut, Poirot pressed the bell once more, summoning the next player in our quiet little drama. He turned to me, his expression thoughtful. She lies, that Mademoiselle Collins. Possibly, I would do the same in her position. He gave me a sharp glance. Now for the butler. Treadwell arrived, his demeanor one of impeccable dignity, his crisp uniform, the measured cadence of his speech. Every detail exuded professionalism and control. His account mirrored that of Mr. Waverly, down to the smallest particulars, but one thing stood out. He admitted, without hesitation, that he was aware of the priest's hole. When at last he withdrew, his composure unshaken, I turned to Poirot. Well, Poirot's expression was one of quiet amusement. What do you make of it all, Hastings? I hesitated. What do you? I countered. He chuckled, wagging a finger at me. Ah, you grow cautious. But the grey cells, Hastings, they will not function unless you stimulate them. Come, let us make our deductions together. What are the most troubling aspects of the case? I considered for a moment before speaking. There's something that doesn't sit right with me. Why would the man who kidnapped the child leave through the South Lodge? The East Lodge was entirely unattended. He could have left without being seen. Poirot's smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. Ah, mon ami, now we are thinking, and that, I assure you, is a most curious question indeed. Poirot's eyes gleamed as he tapped his fingers together, his excitement barely contained. That is a very good point, Hastings, an excellent one, and now, I shall match it with another. Why warn the Waverleys beforehand? Why not simply take the child, and demand ransom afterward? I considered this for a moment. Because they hoped to get the money without actually resorting to the crime, I suggested. Poirot shook his head. But surely, mon ami, it was highly unlikely that the Waverleys would pay such a large sum on the basis of a mere threat. No, there was another purpose behind the warning. I frowned. Perhaps they wanted to focus attention on the stroke of midnight. That way, when the tramp was seized as a distraction, the real culprit could slip away unnoticed with the child. Poirot nodded slowly. That is a fair observation, Hastings, yet it does not change one fundamental truth. They were making something difficult that should have been easy. If they had not set a specific time or date, they could have waited for the perfect opportunity, perhaps when the child was out for a walk with his nurse, and taken him in a motorcar without a single soul witnessing it. I hesitated. Yes, I admitted, though doubt still lingered in my mind. Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. Hastings, this was a performance, an elaborate farce. Now let us look at the case from another perspective. Every clue points to the existence of an accomplice inside the house. I nodded, intrigued. Go on. Point number 1, the mysterious poisoning of Mrs. Waverly, that could not have been orchestrated by someone outside the house. Point number 2, the letter pinned to the pillow, left in the dead of night. Point number 3, the clock deliberately set 10 minutes ahead. All of these acts were committed by someone on the inside. And finally, a detail that I noticed, but perhaps you did not, the priest's hole. What about it? There was no dust. Poirot's voice was triumphant. It had been swept clean with a broom. I sat up straighter. That means, precisely, someone inside the house had been using it recently. He steepled his fingers. Now then, let us consider our suspects. The household consists of 4 individuals, Mr. and Mrs. Waverly, Treadwell the butler, and Miss Collins. The nurse can be excluded from the matter of the priest's hole, as she would have had no reason to access it. However, she could still be involved in the other 3 incidents. That leaves us with 4 possibilities. He paused, then continued in a measured tone. Let us examine Miss Collins first. What do we know of her? Very little. She is an intelligent woman. She has been in this house for just 1 year. And Poirot's gaze sharpened. She lied about the dog. I nodded, recalling our earlier conversation. You said as much yourself. Indeed, Poirot murmured, his eyes glinting, and in a case such as this, even the smallest lie is a thread. Poirot's smile turned peculiar. a glimmer of triumph in his eyes. "Ah, yes, the dog," he murmured, as though speaking to himself. "But let us turn our attention to Treadwell." He tapped a finger against his chin. "There are several rather suspicious facts concerning him. For one, the tramp insists that it was Treadwell who handed him the mysterious parcel in the village. But Treadwell has an alibi for that," I protested. Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, yet that does not absolve him. He could still have been responsible for poisoning Mrs. Waverly, pinning the note to the pillow, tampering with the clock, and sweeping out the priest's hole. But Hastings, there is something that does not sit right. Treadwell has been in the service of the Waverly family his entire life. He is not merely a butler, he is part of the very fabric of this household. Why then would he suddenly betray them and connive in the abduction of the young master? It is not in the picture. Then who?" I demanded. "We must proceed logically, mon ami, no matter how absurd the conclusion may seem." Poirot's voice took on an almost theatrical weight. "Let us briefly consider Mrs. Waverly, but that theory collapses instantly. She is wealthy, immensely so. It is her fortune that has restored this estate from ruin. Why would she stage the kidnapping of her own son and pay the ransom to herself? No, no, that is a dead end." He let the words linger before pressing forward. "Mr. Waverly, however, is an entirely different story." I stared at him, aghast. "Impossible. Is it?" Poirot's voice was quiet, almost pitying. "Consider it carefully. He has a wealthy wife, yes, but having access to wealth is not the same as possessing it. And Hastings, I believe Mrs. Waverly is not a woman who parts with her money easily. She is generous when she deems it necessary, but not without reason." He leaned closer, and looked at Mr. Waverly himself, a man accustomed to luxury, to indulgence, the type who enjoys life but resents being at the mercy of his wife's financial decisions. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "But surely not." Poirot raised a finger. "Who sent the servants away that night?" "Mr. Waverly. He had complete control over the household. He could have written the notes, drugged his wife, tampered with the clock, and created an unshakable alibi for his devoted butler, Treadwell." Poirot's voice turned grim. "And Treadwell Hastings does not like Mrs. Waverly. He serves her out of duty, but his loyalty remains with his master. Then they were both in it together." "Yes, but not just them." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "There was a third man. The driver of the grey car," I exclaimed. "Exactly. That is the mistake the police made. They did not investigate him further. He was Waverly's accomplice, playing his part in the deception. He snatched a child from a nearby village, a boy with golden curls just like young Johnny. He then drove through the East Lodge and exited via the South Lodge, exactly as planned. He waved, he called out cheerfully. He ensured that no one got a clear look at the child's face or the license plate. Then he laid a false trail to London, ensuring that the authorities wasted their time chasing shadows. I exhaled slowly, and in the meantime, Treadwell was handling the other half of the deception. Poirot nodded. "Yes, the parcel, the ransom note, delivered by a rough-looking man, chosen specifically to divert suspicion. And Waverly, the moment the chaos erupted, when the inspector rushed outside, Waverly had just enough time to hide Johnny in the priest's hole before following them out, feigning shock and distress." Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper, and later that day, when the house was calm, when the inspector had left and Miss Collins was conveniently absent, he would have had ample time to take the child away in his own car to a place of safety. I let out a shaky breath. "But what about the dog? And why did Miss Collins lie?" Poirot chuckled softly. "Ah, that was my little jest, mon ami. When I asked her about a toy dog, she thought I meant a real animal. She denied there was one in the house, but of course there were toy dogs." He smiled. "In the nursery." Realization dawned. So Waverly left some of his son's toys in the priest's hole to keep him entertained and silent. Precisely. Poirot's face turned serious. He did not intend to harm his son. He only needed an excuse to force his wife's hand, to make her part with a large sum of money willingly, without suspecting him. A man like Waverly does not consider himself a villain, Hastings. He is simply pragmatic. At that moment, the door swung open, and Mr. Waverly strode in, his expression tense. "Monsieur Poirot, have you discovered anything? Do you have any idea where my son has been taken?" Poirot said nothing. Instead he calmly handed Waverly a folded piece of paper. Waverly snatched it and unfolded it, only to find it blank. He stared at Poirot in confusion. "What is this?" Poirot leaned forward, his voice deadly quiet. "I am waiting for you to write the address down for me." There was a long silence. Waverly's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. Then suddenly, his shoulders sagged. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His voice was barely a whisper. "He is safe. He is with my old gnome 10 miles from here. He is happy and well cared for." Poirot exhaled softly. "I have no doubt of that. If I did, I would not be offering you a second chance." "The scandal," Waverly choked out. "Exactly," Poirot said smoothly. "Your name is old, respected. Do not tarnish it further." He stood up. "You have 24 hours to return the boy. Your wit will surely find a suitable explanation for his reappearance." Poirot walked to the door but paused before leaving. He turned back with a small knowing smile. "Oh, and one last thing, Monsieur Waverly, always remember to sweep in the corners."